The cameras aren't rolling in Brazil. The international press isn't camped outside the central bank. Financial journalists aren't writing breathless headlines about imminent catastrophe. And that's exactly how they want it. Because what's happening in Brazil right now isn't just another emerging market crisis. It's a controlled demolition with a very specific purpose. And if you think this stays contained to South America, you haven't been paying attention to how these collapses actually work. Brazil's debt just crossed $1.6 trillion. Let that number settle in your mind for a moment. Not billion. Trillion. With a T, the fifth largest economy in the world. A nation of 215 million people, carrying a debt burden that grows by the second. But here's what they're not telling you. This isn't about Brazil running up credit cards or spending too much on social programs. This is about a deliberate financial architecture designed to extract wealth, concentrate power, and when the time comes, justify the next phase of global monetary control. You're watching the setup, not the crisis. The crisis comes later, and it comes everywhere. They taught you that national debt is like household debt. Save more, spend less, balance the budget. It's a comforting lie that keeps you compliant while they play an entirely different game. Brazil's debt isn't the result of fiscal irresponsibility. It's the intended outcome of a system designed by institutions you've been told exist to help developing nations. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the Bank for International Settlements. These aren't aid organizations. They're control mechanisms, and Brazil has been on the leash for decades. Go back to the 1980s, Latin America's debt crisis. You probably don't remember it because you were told it was solved. Structural adjustment programs. They called them austerity measures. Privatization, opening markets to foreign capital. Brazil complied. They did everything they were told. Cut spending, sold state assets, welcomed international investors with open arms. And what happened? The debt grew. It always grows. Because the system isn't designed to reduce debt. It's designed to create dependency. Every time Brazil tried to grow its way out, the rules changed. Currency, devaluation, interest rate manipulation, capital flight orchestrated by the very banks that claim to be partners in development. The playbook is always the same. Lend to developing nations at terms that seem reasonable. Wait for any economic shock, natural disaster, commodity price collapse, anything that creates vulnerability, then squeeze. Demand reforms that benefit foreign corporations. Force the sale of strategic assets at fire sale prices. Lock the country into a debt spiral where servicing the interest becomes the primary function of the national budget. Brazil spends more on debt service than on education. More than on healthcare. More than on infrastructure. The entire productive capacity of the nation is being siphoned off to pay interest to foreign creditors. And the creditors? They read the same financial institutions that collapsed the global economy in 2008 and got bailed out with taxpayer money. Your money. Money created out of nothing and given to banks that were too big to fail. Those banks then turned around and used that freshly printed cash to buy Brazilian debt. You subsidized the chains, now choking Brazil's economy. But let's talk about what $1.6 trillion actually means. Not in abstract economic terms. In real power. In real consequences. Brazil is one of the world's largest producers of food. Soybeans, coffee, beef, sugar. They feed hundreds of millions of people across the globe. They have vast mineral wealth. Iron ore, niobium, rare earth elements, critical to modern technology. They have the Amazon rainforest, the lungs of the planet, a biodiversity treasure that holds resources pharmaceutical companies would kill to access. And they're in debt to the tune of $1.6 trillion. Do you see the trap? When you owe that much money, you don't own your resources anymore. Your creditors do. And when the debt becomes unsustainable, when default looks inevitable, that's when the real extraction begins. Not with tanks and soldiers. With foreclosure. With the quiet transfer of sovereign assets to private hands at pennies on the dollar. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented economic history. It happened in Argentina, in Greece, in dozens of nations across Africa and Asia. The debt becomes the weapon. The crisis becomes the opportunity. Now here's where this stops being about Brazil and becomes about you. Because the same financial institutions holding Brazilian debt are woven into the fabric of the global financial system. The pension fund you're counting on for retirement, it owns Brazilian bonds. The mutual funds your savings are parked in, exposure to Latin American debt. The big banks that hold your mortgage, your car loan, your credit card balance, they're counterparties to the derivatives built on top of Brazilian sovereign risk. This isn't isolated. This is interconnected. And when $1.6 trillion of debt starts to wobble, the shockwaves don't respect borders. They're already preparing you for it. You just haven't noticed. Central banks worldwide are talking about digital currencies. Not as innovation, as necessity. They're building the infrastructure for what comes after the next crisis. Because they know the crisis is coming. They engineered it. Brazil is just one pressure point. You've got Italy with debt approaching $3 trillion, Japan with debt exceeding their entire economy by a factor of 2, the United States with debt racing past $35 trillion and climbing faster every single day. These aren't separate problems. They're symptoms of the same disease. A global monetary system built on infinite debt expansion that requires infinite economic growth. And growth is slowing everywhere. Watch what happens when Brazil can't service the debt anymore. They'll go to the IMF. The IMF will offer a bailout with conditions. Harsh conditions, austerity, debt cuts, public services. Privatization that hands strategic industries to foreign corporations. Deregulation that opens the floodgates to capital that extracts and vanishes. The people will protest. They'll take to the streets. The media will show you images of chaos and disorder and blame the government for mismanagement. But the crisis won't be caused by mismanagement. It will be the designed outcome of decades of policy written in Washington and Brussels and Basel. And here's the part that should terrify you. When Brazil collapses, and it will collapse, the contagion spreads. Not immediately, not in one dramatic market crash that makes headlines. Slowly, through interconnected financial instruments that link Brazilian debt to pension funds in California, insurance companies in Germany, sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East. When those instruments start failing, when counterparties can't meet margin calls, when trust evaporates from the system, that's when your savings account, it becomes a casualty of a crisis that started in São Paulo. You thought 2008 was bad. That was a dress rehearsal. A housing bubble in the United States triggered a global financial meltdown because banks had sliced and packaged bad mortgages into securities and sold them to institutions around the world. Everyone was exposed to everyone else's risk, and nobody knew how deep the rot went until Lehman Brothers collapsed and the entire system froze. They patched it with bailouts and quantitative easing and promises that they'd fix the problems. They didn't fix anything. They made it worse. They added more debt. They inflated bigger bubbles. And now those bubbles are everywhere. In stocks trading at valuations disconnected from earnings. In real estate priced beyond the reach of ordinary people. In corporate debt taken on at artificially low interest rates that are now rising. And in sovereign debt, $1.6 trillion of it in Brazil alone. You need to understand the mechanism. When a country defaults on its debt, the bondholders take losses. But bondholders today aren't wealthy individuals clipping coupons. They're institutions managing your retirement savings. Your pension fund bought Brazilian bonds because they offered higher yields than safe assets. Higher yields mean higher risk. But the people managing your pension didn't tell you that. They chased returns to cover promises they made about your retirement income. Now those bonds are sitting in your portfolio and you don't even know it. When Brazil defaults, your pension takes a hit. Your retirement gets delayed. Your standard of living drops. And the financial advisors who put you in that position will shrug and say nobody could have seen it coming. Except they could. They did. They just didn't care. This is the pattern. This is how it always works. Create debt. Let it grow. Wait for crisis. Consolidate control. The people who designed this system know exactly what they're doing. They've run this playbook in every major financial crisis for the past century. The Great Depression, the Latin American debt crisis, the Asian financial crisis, the dot-com crash, the housing bubble. Every single time, wealth concentrates upward. Assets move from public to private hands, and the people who saw it coming, who positioned themselves correctly, who had access to the real information, they profit. Everyone else loses. Brazil's $1.6 trillion debt isn't an accident, it's an execution, and the execution is already underway. You're just watching it in slow motion, not recognizing the pattern because they've trained you to look at each event in isolation. A budget deficit here, a credit downgrade there, political instability, currency fluctuation. You see disconnected news stories. They see a coordinated collapse moving toward its inevitable conclusion. And when that conclusion arrives, when the dominoes start falling, you won't have time to react. Your savings will be trapped in accounts that suddenly have withdrawal limits. Your pension will announce funding shortfalls. Your job will disappear as companies exposed to the crisis start cutting costs, and you'll be told this was unpredictable. An unfortunate confluence of circumstances. Bad luck. It's not luck. It's design. And here's what keeps you trapped. You still believe in the system. You still think governments work for you. That central banks exist to maintain stability. That financial institutions are bound by rules that protect ordinary people. That belief is your cage. Because while you're trusting the system is preparing to betray you. Again, just like it did in 2008 when retirement accounts evaporated and homes were foreclosed and jobs disappeared and you were told to tighten your belt while banks got bailouts. Just like it did in every crisis before that. The pattern doesn't change. Only the specific details vary. Brazil is the canary, not because it's weak, because it's visible. A massive economy with deep structural problems that mirror the problems everywhere else. Too much debt, too little growth. Too much wealth extraction, too little real productivity. A financial system built on speculation and leverage instead of actual value creation? Sound familiar? It should, because that's the description of every major economy on Earth right now. Brazil is just further along the curve. They're showing you your future, if you're paying attention. But most people aren't paying attention. They're watching entertainment, following political theater, arguing about manufactured controversies designed to keep them distracted, while the real power moves happen in meeting rooms they'll never access. The decisions that will determine whether your savings survive the next decade aren't being made in public. They're being made in Basel at the Bank for International Settlements, in closed-door meetings between central bankers and finance ministers, in conference rooms at BlackRock and JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs. And the decision has already been made. The collapse is coming. The only question is timing and control. They need you unprepared. They need you confused. They need you blaming the wrong people when it happens, so you look at who actually benefited. When Brazil's debt crisis goes critical, you'll be told it's because of corrupt politicians or lazy workers or poor economic management. You won't be told about the predatory lending, the currency manipulation, the resource extraction mass disinvestment, the decades of policy designed to create exactly this outcome. You'll be fed a narrative that protects the people who caused the crisis and blames the victims. And if you're not awake to the pattern, you'll believe it. The clock is ticking. Brazil's debt grows every second. The interest compounds. The ability to service it diminishes. And somewhere, in a quiet office tower in New York or London or Frankfurt, someone is calculating the exact moment to pull the trigger. Because that's what this is. A controlled demolition with a specific timeline and specific objectives. When it serves their purpose, the crisis will accelerate. And when it does, the panic will be real. The losses will be real. Your financial pain will be very, very real. While they walk away with the assets purchased at collapsed prices, ready to do it all over again in the next cycle. You're not going to stop this. You're not going to reform the system from inside. The system protects itself. What you can do is see it clearly, understand the pattern, recognize that what's happening in Brazil is a preview of what's coming everywhere, and ask yourself one question. When the debt crisis that's already baked into the global financial system finally detonates, where will you be standing? Will you be holding assets that evaporate overnight? Or will you have positioned yourself outside the blast radius? Because they're not going to warn you when the time comes. They're going to act first and explain later. And by the time you understand what happened, it will be too late to protect what you've spent a lifetime building. Brazil's $1.6 trillion debt isn't just their problem, it's yours. The question is whether you'll realize it before the collapse makes it impossible to ignore. The fuse is lit. The only question now is how long until it reaches the powder keg.